Racist lawyer ridicules witness, then learns she's the prosecuting attorney. It was a crisp autumn morning in downtown Chicago, where the air carried a sharp bite and the faint aroma of fresh coffee lingered from nearby cafes. The old courthouse towered over the cityscape, its marble facade weathered but commanding. Inside, the usual buzz of early morning legal proceedings filled the air as attorneys shuffled through hallways, their briefcases clutched tightly, and defendants anxiously awaited their fate. Among them stood Alexandra Pierce, a poised and formidable attorney known for her razor-sharp arguments and fiery demeanor. At 38, Alexandra was a force to be reckoned with, her reputation for dismantling witnesses on the stand preceding her. She adjusted the cuffs of her tailored gray suit as she prepared for another day in court. Today was supposed to be straightforward, a routine cross-examination in a high-profile embezzlement case. The courtroom was already filled with spectators, eager to witness Alexandra's brilliance. She entered with an air of confidence, her heels clicking purposefully against the polished wood floor. The judge had barely taken his seat when Alexandra began unpacking her notes, her eyes flickering toward the witness stand where a young woman sat nervously, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The witness, Danielle Monroe, appeared unassuming. She was a petite black woman with intelligent eyes and a composed demeanor. Her simple navy blouse and neatly styled hair betrayed none of the fire Alexandra expected to see in her opposition. To Alexandra, this was just another hurdle to overcome, another witness to unravel with her incisive questioning. She had no idea what lay ahead. The judge's gavel struck, calling the court to order. Alexandra rose smoothly, her tone sharp but respectful as she addressed the witness. "Ms. Monroe, could you explain to the court your involvement with the defendant?" Alexandra began, her voice cutting through the room. Danielle answered calmly, her voice steady. "I was part of the investigative team that uncovered the fraudulent transactions." Alexandra's brow arched slightly. "An investigator?" This wasn't in the pretrial notes. She quickly composed herself and continued, pressing Danielle with pointed questions. But no matter how Alexandra tried to trip her up, Danielle responded with precision, her answers unwavering. A ripple of unease stirred in Alexandra as the pieces of the puzzle shifted in her mind. Something about this witness didn't add up. She'd underestimated her. The tension in the room thickened with each exchange, the audience leaning forward in their seats. Alexandra, who thrived on control, felt it slipping through her grasp for the first time in years. Then came the moment that silenced the room. As Alexandra attempted to corner Danielle on a technicality, the witness leaned forward, her eyes locking with Alexandra's. A confident smile played on her lips as she reached into her bag and placed a leather case with a gold insignia on the table. Opening it, she revealed her badge. "Miss Pierce," Danielle said, her voice now carrying an undeniable authority, "I'm not just a witness. I'm the prosecuting attorney for this case." The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Alexandra froze, her mind racing to process what had just happened. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant, and the woman she had just ridiculed now held all the cards. As Danielle leaned back in her chair, the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in her expression, Alexandra realized she was no longer the one dictating the narrative. The stage was set for a battle unlike any Alexandra had ever faced, and the stakes had just been raised. Her reputation, her career, and her sense of control were all on the line. What had begun as a routine day in court had transformed into a defining moment, not just for Alexandra, but for the entire courtroom. The room buzzed with an undercurrent of shock and anticipation as Danielle Monroe calmly reclosed her badge case and placed it beside her on the witness stand. The judge's gavel struck once, a sharp reminder to the court to restore order, but the whispers persisted, an audible testament to the unprecedented twist. For Alexandra Pierce, this moment was a nightmare she hadn't foreseen. The courtroom was her domain, a stage where she performed with precision and unmatched skill. Now, the witness she had sought to undermine had transformed into a prosecutorial adversary of formidable stature. Her carefully crafted strategy unraveled in an instant, leaving her exposed before an audience that included colleagues, opposing counsel, and the press. The judge, his voice firm, addressed the court. Miss Pierce, I trust you will proceed with decorum and professionalism. Alexandra's sharp mind scrambled to regain control. Decorum was the least of her concerns. If Danielle Monroe was indeed the prosecuting attorney, that meant she had access to the full breadth of evidence Alexandra had meticulously prepared to dismantle. Her opponent was no longer an unassuming witness, but someone armed with intimate knowledge of the case's intricacies. Alexandra turned toward her client, who sat rigidly at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. Richard Hartman, a powerful CEO accused of embezzling millions from his employees' retirement fund, had hired her for her ruthless reputation. But now, even he seemed to sense the shifting tides. Danielle's voice broke through Alexandra's thoughts. Your Honor, I'd like to clarify my role in this case for the record. The judge nodded. Proceed. As the lead prosecutor, I oversaw the investigative team that gathered the evidence presented here today, Danielle said, her tone calm but commanding. She gestured toward the rows of binders and files stacked neatly on the prosecution's table. This includes forensic accounting reports, witness depositions, and digital communications that outline the defendant's actions over several years. Each word landed like a blow, and Alexandra knew the jury was absorbing every syllable. The seeds of doubt she had tried to plant earlier now withered under the weight of Danielle's authority. Alexandra clenched her jaw, forcing herself to appear unaffected. As Danielle detailed her team's findings, Alexandra's thoughts churned. She needed a strategy, and she needed it fast. She flipped through her notes, scanning for any detail that could be weaponized against her new adversary. If she couldn't discredit the evidence, she would have to discredit the prosecutor herself. When Danielle finished, she returned her gaze to Alexandra, a glint of challenge in her eyes. It was subtle, but Alexandra recognized it for what it was, a declaration of war. For a moment, their eyes locked, a silent battle of wills playing out in full view of the court. Thank you, Ms. Monroe, the judge said. Miss Pierce, you may proceed with your cross-examination. Alexandra rose, smoothing her suit jacket. She couldn't afford to falter now. Stepping forward, she approached the witness stand, her heels clicking against the floor in a measured rhythm. She would dismantle Danielle piece by piece if that's what it took to protect her client and salvage her reputation. Ms. Monroe, Alexandra began, her voice sharp but measured, you mentioned overseeing the investigation. Can you provide details about your qualifications for such a role? For instance, how many years of experience do you have as a prosecutor? Danielle's expression didn't waver. I've been a federal prosecutor for over a decade, specializing in financial crimes. Before that, I earned my law degree from Yale and worked as a forensic auditor. Alexandra's stomach sank, but she pressed on. Impressive credentials. Yet, as a prosecutor, you are inherently biased against the defendant, correct? Danielle's lips curved into a slight smile. My role is to present the truth based on evidence, Ms. Pierce. Bias has no place in my work. The courtroom's air grew taut, the audience riveted by the clash between these two formidable women. Alexandra's mind raced, aware that every question she posed was a double-edged sword. But she couldn't stop now. The battle had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. The courtroom had never felt so suffocating. Every word spoken seemed to hang in the air, thick and electric. Alexandra Pierce paced the defense table, her polished heels clicking against the tile in a rhythm that mirrored her pounding heart. The dynamic between her and Danielle Monroe had transformed this trial into more than a battle of evidence. It was now a contest of wills. Danielle's meticulous testimony had reshaped the narrative in front of the jury. The once confident glances Alexandra had received from them earlier in the trial now flickered with skepticism. She'd spent years mastering the art of persuasion, but this was unlike any opponent she had faced. Danielle's presence was undeniable, her credibility ironclad. Alexandra needed a new angle, and fast. During the midday recess, Alexandra's frustration boiled over. She stormed into the defense's consultation room, where Richard Hartman sat with an expression that oscillated between panic and indignation. "What are you doing to fix this?" he demanded, his voice rising. You're letting her make me look guilty. Alexandra held up a hand, silencing him with a glare. I don't need you undermining me right now, Richard, she snapped. She may have the jury's attention for now, but I know how to dismantle her piece by piece. Trust me. Trust you, he hissed. She's painting me as a villain, and you're just standing there letting her do it. Alexandra bit back a sharp retort, instead turning her frustration inward. He wasn't wrong, Danielle had seized the upper hand. But Alexandra had no intention of relinquishing it permanently. As the court reconvened, Alexandra's mind churned with strategy. She would need to be surgical in her approach, dismantling Danielle's arguments without appearing desperate. When Danielle took the stand again, Alexandra's questions came sharper, more precise. Ms. Monroe, Alexandra began, her voice smooth and deliberate, you mentioned earlier that the financial records were audited under your supervision. Were these audits conducted by independent accounting standards, or were they tailored specifically for this case? Danielle didn't flinch. They were conducted according to established standards, with additional procedures to address the unique aspects of the investigation. Alexandra's lips curled into a faint, calculated smile. Additional procedures. Meaning they deviated from traditional audits? Danielle's tone remained steady. They supplemented traditional audits, ensuring no detail was overlooked. The jury's attention shifted again, their gazes darting between the two women. Alexandra could see their uncertainty, the cracks in Danielle's invulnerability beginning to show. Yet, just as Alexandra sensed she might regain control, Danielle countered with a statement that left the room silent. It's interesting, Danielle said, addressing the court as much as Alexandra, that the defense is attempting to scrutinize procedures designed to ensure transparency. Transparency that ultimately revealed the defendant's actions. The remark landed with the precision of a well-aimed arrow. Alexandra's rebuttal caught in her throat, and she could feel the tide shifting once more. Danielle's composure wasn't just unnerving, it was infuriating. As the day's proceedings wore on, Alexandra faced mounting challenges. Witnesses corroborated Danielle's evidence, each one bolstering the prosecution's case. And though Alexandra's cross-examinations were fierce, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing defense, a position she despised. By late afternoon, Alexandra's nerves were fraying. She retreated to her office, where she sat in silence, staring at her meticulously organized notes. Her mind replayed the day's events, each misstep and missed opportunity gnawing at her confidence. For the first time, she allowed herself to question if she could win this case. She'd built a career on crushing opposition, but Danielle wasn't just opposition. She was a mirror, reflecting Alexandra's tenacity and intelligence. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Her assistant, Evelyn, entered cautiously, holding a file. You should see this, Evelyn said, placing the document on the desk. Alexandra flipped it open, her eyes scanning the contents. It was an anonymous tip, detailing a potential conflict of interest involving Danielle Monroe. A gasp escaped her lips as she read further. If true, it could shift the entire trajectory of the trial. But using it would be a gamble, one that could backfire spectacularly. The weight of the decision bore down on Alexandra. She'd always prided herself on winning clean, but now, with the stakes higher than ever, she faced a moral dilemma. Was she willing to compromise her principles to ensure victory? And if she did, would it even guarantee success against an opponent as formidable as Danielle? As she stared at the file, Alexandra realized the battle wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about who she was, who she had become, and who she wanted to be. The struggle had deepened, and the outcome was more uncertain than ever. The courtroom was electric with tension as the final day of the trial began. The gallery was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Alexandra Pierce stood at the defense table, her face a mask of calm professionalism, but inside, her nerves were taut as piano strings. The anonymous tip she'd received sat in a sealed envelope on the corner of her desk, its contents a double-edged sword she hadn't yet decided to wield. Across the aisle, Danielle Monroe exuded her usual poise. Her confidence, however, was tinged with something more pronounced today, triumph. The prosecution's case had been meticulously constructed, each piece of evidence and testimony slotting into place with unnerving precision. The jury had watched, captivated, as Danielle unraveled the story of Richard Hartman's embezzlement. The defense had scored a few points, but none significant enough to counterbalance the weight of the evidence. As the judge called the session to order, Alexandra rose for her closing arguments. She took a deep breath and approached the jury, her voice steady and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "you've heard a lot of compelling evidence over the past weeks. The prosecution has painted a vivid picture of my client as a man who exploited his position and betrayed the trust of his employees. But I'm here to remind you of something fundamental: appearances can be deceiving." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Richard Hartman built his company from the ground up," Alexandra continued. "He's not perfect, none of us are. But the prosecution's narrative is built on assumptions and inferences. They've relied on circumstantial evidence to tell a story, and while it's compelling, it doesn't meet the standard of proof required to convict." Her eyes swept across the jury, gauging their reactions. She could see some nods, but others remained inscrutable. "The prosecution has also asked you to trust their investigator, someone who has presented themselves as impartial, as someone merely seeking the truth. But what if I told you that this investigator has ties to parties with vested interests in my client's downfall?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Danielle's head snapped up, her calm composure momentarily faltering. Alexandra stepped back to her desk and picked up the envelope. "Your Honor," Alexandra said, addressing the bench, "I'd like to enter into evidence a document that calls into question the objectivity of the prosecution's lead investigator, Ms. Monroe." The judge raised an eyebrow, motioning for her to approach. Danielle's expression hardened as Alexandra handed the envelope to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. He opened it, scanning the contents with a neutral expression that betrayed nothing. "I'll allow it," the judge said after a moment. "Proceed carefully, Ms. Pierce." Danielle's jaw tightened as Alexandra returned to the center of the courtroom, holding up a copy of the document for the jury to see. "This is a signed affidavit from a former associate of Ms. Monroe," Alexandra explained. "It states that she previously worked on a case involving my client's largest competitor. That competitor, coincidentally, stands to gain significantly if my client is convicted and his company collapses." The gallery erupted in whispers. Danielle stood abruptly, her voice cutting through the noise. "Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to distract from the facts of the case," she declared. The judge banged his gavel. "Ms. Monroe, you'll have an opportunity to respond. For now, Ms. Pierce has the floor." Alexandra turned back to the jury, her tone calm but firm. "I'm not asking you to dismiss all the evidence you've seen. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that the case against my client has been influenced by factors beyond the pursuit of justice." When she finished her argument, Alexandra returned to her seat, her heart pounding. Danielle rose for her rebuttal, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of steel. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is a classic defense tactic, deflection," Danielle said. "Ms. Pierce has introduced a document that, while real, fails to demonstrate any conflict of interest. My role in this case has always been to seek the truth, and the evidence I've presented speaks for itself. Don't let baseless accusations distract you from the facts." Her words carried weight, and Alexandra could see the jury's uncertainty. Danielle's composure was unshaken, even in the face of a direct attack. Alexandra realized that while the affidavit had sown doubt, it hadn't dismantled the prosecution's case. The judge adjourned the session, and the jury retired to deliberate. The hours that followed were agonizing. Alexandra sat in the defense room, her mind replaying every moment of the trial. She'd taken a risk introducing the affidavit, but had it been enough? Finally, the jury returned, their expressions solemn. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict slip. "In the matter of the state versus Richard Hartman," the foreperson began, "we find the defendant." The pause stretched into eternity. Alexandra held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of gasps and shouts. Alexandra exhaled, relief and disbelief washing over her. Richard clasped her hand, murmuring his gratitude, but Alexandra barely heard him. Across the aisle, Danielle's expression was unreadable, though her clenched jaw hinted at frustration. The judge dismissed the court, and as the room began to clear, Alexandra and Danielle locked eyes. There was no malice, only a shared understanding of the battle they just waged. Alexandra nodded slightly, acknowledging her opponent's skill, before turning to leave. Outside the courthouse, the brisk autumn air felt different. For Alexandra, it wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point. The case had tested her like no other, forcing her to confront not just the flaws in the system but the ones within herself. And as she walked away, she knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. The courtroom emptied slowly, the echoes of the verdict still reverberating through the hushed halls. Alexandra Pierce stood near the defense table, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the surface as she processed what had just happened. The jury's decision had vindicated her client, but the case had left an indelible mark on everyone involved, including herself. Richard Hartman, his expression a mixture of relief and disbelief, turned to Alexandra. "You saved my life," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. I don't even know how to thank you." Alexandra offered a tight smile. "The evidence spoke for itself," she replied, though the weight of the trial's moral complexities lingered in her tone. "What matters now is how you move forward. Make sure you do something meaningful with this second chance." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Alexandra answered their questions with practiced restraint, acknowledging the complexities of the case without revealing too much. Danielle Monroe stood nearby, flanked by members of her team. The prosecutor's face was composed, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of disappointment. Despite the loss, Danielle's integrity shone through in her brief statement to the press. "The jury has spoken, and we respect their decision," Danielle said. "Our commitment to justice remains unwavering. This case highlights the importance of holding powerful individuals accountable, and we will continue to pursue that mission." The words carried no bitterness, only conviction. Alexandra couldn't help but admire Danielle's resilience. As their eyes met across the media frenzy, there was a silent acknowledgement of mutual respect. The battle between them had been fierce, but it was clear neither bore ill will. Later that evening, Alexandra returned to her office, the city lights flickering outside her window. She sat at her desk, staring at the affidavit she had introduced during the trial. It had been a bold move, and though it had worked, it left her uneasy. She couldn't ignore the question that lingered in her mind: had she crossed a line in her pursuit of victory? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Evelyn, her assistant, stepped in, holding a small package. "This just arrived for you," Evelyn said, placing it on the desk before leaving. Alexandra opened it to find a handwritten note from Danielle. "Alexandra, in the heat of battle, we sometimes lose sight of what truly matters. Let this case serve as a reminder to both of us: the pursuit of justice is never simple, but it must always be honorable. Until our paths cross again. Danielle Monroe." Beneath the note was a small, polished stone inscribed with a single word: integrity. Alexandra held the stone in her hand, its cool surface grounding her. For the first time in weeks, a sense of calm washed over her. She placed the stone on her desk, a tangible reminder of the lessons she'd learned. This trial was over, but the challenges ahead were countless. And yet, Alexandra knew she was ready for them. The fight for justice, real justice, was just beginning, and she would face it with a renewed sense of purpose.